because if we are going to understand how that complex, tempestuous and murderous at times relationship developed, then we do need to understand the context in which that was happening, and the situation in Wales, the political situation that the Normans inherited and came into. So I invite Dr. Euryn Roberts to come up and to give us our first talk, please.
Thank you for the welcome and for the invitation, Philip, received back in 2019, so we've had plenty of time to prepare these lectures. Right then. So, for historians of medieval Wales, like those of England, the 11th century is very much an age of conquests. But whereas the 14th of October 1066 was a fatal day for many in England and retains its importance as an important chronological marker in recounting the country's history, to the west of Offa's conquest, like Welsh devolution in more recent decades, resembled a process, not a neat, definitive event. The free-for-all that was Welsh politics during the time of the Norman conquest of England was shaped by the internal dynamics of Welsh society and political culture, and also drew in outside forces from amongst the Irish and the Hiberno-Scandinavians, the Anglo-Saxons, and eventually the Normans themselves from around 1070 onwards. Unlike the recently unified Kingdom of England, Wales at the turn of the second millennium was a land of many kings, many dynasties, and many kingdoms, as it would continue to be to a greater or lesser extent up until 1283. There was nothing definitive about the political geography of power in 11th century Wales, nor can claims to kingliness be easily defined in this period. Power hinged on military prowess rather than on jurisdictional authority, and was exercised, in practical terms at least, through gift-giving, imposing tribute, plundering, and alliances. Against this background, it is no wonder that, in the words of Rhys Davies, and I quote, competition and conquest were the essence of successful kingship in medieval Wales. As an arena for competing ambitions and as a land of opportunity, Wales in the 11th century offered men, both native and foreign, the prospect of power and prestige. But to come on top of the pile in such a violently competitive and divided society required skill, talent, and luck. So hopefully this will move forward if I do this. Great. Well, in order to keep the material under control and to keep to my allotted time and brief my lecture today, I suppose inspired by the medieval Welsh practice of arranging all learning into groupings of three, often in sophisticated stylistic triads, addresses three main areas or three main points. I suppose a little bit like a Welsh nonconformist sermon. So first, we need to look at some general patterns and interpretations. How have historians grappled with the history of 11th century Wales, and what themes have they been drawn to? Answering these questions should help us understand why some historians have characterised the 11th century as, to quote Carrie Maund, one of the most complex periods in the history of independent Wales. Tracing these developments should give us a clearer sense of why the security of what would later become the Middle March, so that broad band of territory running from north to south, from southern Shropshire to the area on Monmouth bordering on Gloucestershire, why that area, and then spreading, of course, westwards into Wales, into those lands between the Wye and the Severn, why those areas after 1066 should make it onto William the Conqueror's military agenda. My second concern this morning is with one individual in particular, the energetic and ruthless Gruffudd ap Llywelyn, who, on his death in 1064, was commemorated in the vernacular Welsh chronicles as, I quote, the head and shield and defender of the Britons. Although necessarily selective, I hope to give you a sense of the nature and extent of Gruffudd's power, who outdid all other native and non-native would-be conquerors in 11th century Wales. No other Welsh ruler, not even the powerful princes of 13th century Wales, ever came close to emulating the territorial conquests of Gruffudd ap Llywelyn, who, from about 1055 to 1064, held Wales in its entirety under his sway. So a 11th century sort of Mark Drakeford then. If Gruffudd's rise to power was spectacular, then so was his demise, and the fallout would have long-lasting and far-reaching consequences. In the final part of this lecture, our attention will turn to the half-century or so following Gruffudd's death, or to what might perhaps be irreverently termed 1064 and all that. This vacuum of authority, along with the entry of a new element in the history of Wales, the Normans, was to usher in a new political and social landscape, which in terms of its lasting significance must be counted with the Industrial Revolution as one of the key transformative processes of Welsh history. I should add, of course, that whilst my brief today is ostensibly concerned with the politics of Wales on the eve and in the immediate aftermath of the Norman conquest of England, for a good part of the 11th century, the so-called Welsh question was far more than a mere border difficulty for the people of the Middle Marches. If political ambitions and political instability on both sides of the blurred ethnic frontier in this area had a tendency to overlap before the Tudor legislations of 1536 and 1543, it did so with particular frequency and ferocity during the 11th century. So, to start then with a question, how then have historians tended to interpret the history of Wales during the 11th century, and what patterns or themes can we observe? One elementary premise of mine, and something which echoes the modern historiography of pre-conquest England, is that we should not regard the 11th century in Wales as some prologue to the Norman conquest, nor as a mere prelude to the 12th and 13th century so-called Age of the Princes in Wales. This is a period which deserves to be studied for its own sake. Of course, such noble intentions do not come without their problems. Our knowledge of so much of the history of Wales during this period hangs by a narrow thread. Although better documented than the preceding centuries, our interpretation is hampered by the dearth of contemporary evidence. We must extrapolate much of the evidence from later sources, many of which cast their long shadows backwards in time. This naturally calls for much discernment and a determination to win out the contemporary evidence from the retrospective. Take, for instance, the Welsh chronicles for the 10th and 11th centuries, which provide little more than short telegraphic snippets of information. Though not sustained coherent accounts, what they do provide, however, is an insight, albeit indirectly, into the political habits and cultural norms of native society. They leave us in no doubt that political competition was recurrent and frequently murderous, and where dying of old age could be seen as something of a notable achievement for a Welsh king. The principal danger of taking our sources at face value is that they tend to concentrate on the winners, and as a result, historians have been inclined to favour those dynasties that would later come to dominate high medieval Wales. We might well be advised to approach our sources circumspectly then. So what general patterns can we observe in Wales during this period? First, Wales in the 11th century, like contemporary England and Ireland, saw the rise of new dynasties. During the 9th and 10th centuries, The whole of Wales, apart from the very far southeast, the pre-1974 counties of Glamorgan and Monmouthshire, had fallen into the hands of the descendants of Merfyn Vrych, or Mervyn the Speckled. Merfyn, from his probable power base on the Isle of Man, was able, during the second quarter of the 9th century, to assume the kingship of Gwynedd in the north, and his descendants, later called the Merfynion, after their ancestor. Historians also refer to them as the second dynasty of Gwynedd as well. This family would come to dominate Wales on and off down to the Edwardian conquest of 1282-83. The Merfynion's dominance in the 9th and 10th centuries had much to do with external factors, notably the Viking incursions and the rise of Wessex. While Anglo-Saxon raids into Wales, including from truncated Mercia, continued into the period and were a major concern in the Welsh chronicles, the period was also marked by cooperation and submission, most noticeably during the reign of Athelstan in England and Hywel the Good's hegemony in Wales. Following the death of Hywel in 950, however, the dynastic politics of the Merfynion was marked by successive rounds of violence, dynastic segmentation, and Viking intervention. By the time we get to the 11th century, new dynasties had emerged to challenge the Merfynion, and it was individuals from these families who'd do much to shape subsequent events over the coming decades. Crucially, however, the Merfynion did not disappear, and later descendants of Merfyn Vrych were eventually able to regain prominence during the late 11th century. Writing in 1911, John Edward Lloyd, or J. Lloyd, the father of the modern study of medieval Welsh history, commented that the most noteworthy feature of 11th century Wales was the success of so-called pretenders in seizing power. Subsequent interpretations of the 11th century have moved away from this paradigm of legitimacy and have attempted to examine the dynamics of politics in far greater detail, and with less of a willingness to concede to the Merfynion the pride of place. This change in outlook should help us view one man in particular in a different light, Gruffudd ap Llywelyn. The son of a so-called pretender, Gruffudd's hegemony during the central years of the 11th century were, in the words of Carimond, marked the height of native Welsh power with the unification of the whole country under a single ruler. However, there is a temptation to view Gruffudd's stunning achievements as no more than a fleeting departure from the incessantly competitive and febrile world of Welsh dynastic politics. With hindsight, we may well call his successes into question, bearing in mind that he founded no lasting dynasty, while his immediate successors were unable to exploit his inheritance. But for a short period of time at least, he ruled more of the country than any other Welsh ruler before or after. For John Edward Lloyd at least, his significance lay in the fact that Gruffudd had, and I quote, bequeathed to the Welsh people the priceless legacy of a revived national spirit. In his vigour and daring, the nation felt its youth renewed and no longer harboured the hidden fear that it had grown old and effete amongst the peoples of the earth. Well, Lloyd, a historian of the First Order, had an inclination for such purple passages. And if vigour and daring were ever needed, then the years following 1064 were very much a period to possess such qualities. From amongst the Welsh, and shortly the Normans, adventurers, political exiles and freebooters fought over the carcass of Gruffudd ap Llywelyn's hegemony. Like Gruffudd, many of them ranged across the whole of Wales, and the country was, from north to south, fair game to their ambitions. Wales, during the second half of the 11th century, witnessed far-reaching changes in the nature and distribution of political power. Unsurprisingly, this struggle for supremacy has been a major theme of historians of medieval Wales. From this tangled web, we can observe three broad strands in the history of 11th century Wales. First, the temporary eclipse of the dynasty of Merfyn Frych. Secondly, the ascendancy of Gruffudd ap Llywelyn. And lastly, the struggle for supremacy in the aftermaths of 1064 and 1066. Put together, they possibly justify the claim that the 11th century is amongst the most complex periods in the history of Wales. More importantly for us this morning, all three strands encroached on the middle march of Wales, an area where the English had once feared Welsh raids, and with a shift in the balance of power, the Welsh would soon be more often the victims of Norman incursions. Having given you what I hope was a panoramic view of 11th century Wales, I now want to deploy the historical camera to give you a close-up view of my second concern today, the rise and fall of Gruffudd ap Llywelyn. So who was Gruffudd, and what claim did he have to power? As we can see on the diagram here, Gruffudd's father, Llywelyn ap Seillys, is the first of the so-called intrusive rulers, according to Lloyd, whose actions and ambitions we can faintly trace. The Welsh chronicles, in their Latin and vernacular incarnations, are largely silent about events in Wales during the first 2 decades of the 11th century. The death of Cynan ap Hywel, ruler of Gwynedd, or North Wales, is recorded in the year 1003. But no mention is made of any successor. This is in quite sharp contrast to the prominence given to events in England and Ireland in the Welsh chronicles. Llywelyn ap Seillys, Gruffudd's father, makes his first appearance in 1017 or 1018 when he is named as the slayer of Eiddan ap Blagowrid and his 4 sons. Eiddan may well be the subject of the lament in the enigmatic poem Echrys Ynys, which by inference would suggest that Llywelyn ap Seillys drew support from north-east Wales. The obscurity of Llywelyn ap Seillys' dynastic origins was no barrier, however, to further conquests. By 1022, Llywelyn felt confident enough to extend his authority into the Deheubarth, or southwest Wales, by defeating a certain Rhain, who in most versions of the Welsh chronicles is labelled Rhain the Irishman, and who claimed to be the son of Meredydd ab Owain, the last named ruler of the Deheubarth, who had died in the year 999. Llywelyn's ambitions in the south were further cemented by his marriage, which cannot be dated with any certainty, to Angharad, the daughter of Meredydd ab Owain. The hegemony built up by Llywelyn ap Seillys did not, however, survive his abrupt death in 1023, which it would seem happened peacefully rather than violently. Well, to what extent did Llywelyn ap Seillys lay the foundation for his son's future ambitions? That's impossible to know. No doubt Gruffudd was still a child when his father passed away in 1023. It is possible that Gruffudd was raised in Powys, and much later, Walter Map, writing in the 1180s, and probably drawing on border traditions, presents Gruffudd as a lazy and gutless youth who was only galvanised into action by the sharp tongue of his sister. Gruffudd ap Llywelyn makes his first appearance in the Welsh Chronicles in 1039, where he's named as the successor to Iago ap Idwal, king of Gwynedd. We're not told whether Gruffudd's rise to power in the north owed anything to violence. However, what we can say with some certainty at least is that his ambitions in South Wales were pursued by military means. In 1039, he also launched an attack on Hywel ap Edwin, king of the Deheubarth, and expelled him from his territory. By 1041, Gruffudd was forced to do battle with Hywel ap Edwin again, this time seizing his enemy's wife and taking her for himself after his victory at the Battle of Pencader. Mastery over the south would, however, take a further 14 years, with Gruffudd only succeeding in vanquishing Hywel ap Edwin for good in 1044 and facing further opposition from the sons of Rhydderch ap Iestyn between 1045 and 1055. In 1047, for example, Gruffudd was forced to harry the regions of southwest Wales after the men of Ystrad Tywi, so the area surrounding Carmarthen, had treacherously slaughtered a large contingent from his warband. Gruffudd ap Llywelyn's problems in the south were further compounded by Irish and Hiberno-Scandinavian involvement, which had done much, it would seem, to sustain the hopes of Hywel ap Edwin and the men of the southeast, and the men of the southwest. After an eventful couple of decades, to say the least, and with the elimination of Gruffudd ap Rhydderch ap Iestyn in 1055, Gruffudd ap Llywelyn's power encompassed Wales in its entirety. Well, if South Wales was a pressing concern for Gruffudd ap Llywelyn up until about 1055, then during the remaining 9 years of his life, his attention were very much drawn eastwards towards England. That said, aggression along the frontier was nothing new for Gruffudd. As early as 1039, and during the first year of his rule, as ruler of Gwynedd, he'd scored a notable victory against the Mercians at Rhyd y Groes on the Severn in the vicinity of Buttington. By the 1050s, Gruffudd had become a force to be reckoned with and a potential useful ally for those engaged in the power struggles of Edward the Confessor's reign. In 1046, Gruffudd and Svein, the eldest son of Earl Godwin, had conducted a joint campaign in south-east Wales. We do not know how Gruffudd viewed the growing power of Earl Godwin's sons during the 1050s, but some hint of his unease is given by his willingness to sanction an alliance with the outlawed Alfgar, son of Leofric, Earl of Mercia, in 1055. Their relationship was soon bolstered by joint military action and, possibly in 1057, by Gruffudd's marriage to Ealdgyth, Aelfgar's daughter. The capture and sack of Hereford in October 1055 was a notable success for Aelfgar and Gruffudd's allied force, and makes plain the Welsh king's willingness to fish in the unsettled waters of Edward the Confessor's England. As a result, peace was agreed at Billingsley between Ludlow and Bridgenorth, and Aelfgar was re-granted his earldom by King Edward. Political conditions within England and along the Anglo-Welsh border remained highly volatile. In June 1056, Leofgar, the new Bishop of Hereford and previously Harold Godwinson's chaplain, led a reckless expedition into Wales. In the ensuing clash with Gruffudd's army, Leofgar and many of his men were put to the sword. This humiliating defeat did much to cement Gruffudd's reputation amongst the English, and may indeed have impressed upon Harold Godwinson the need to neutralise this Welsh king. In the immediate short term, however, Gruffudd's victory ensured peace and recognition, both of his status as Edward the Confessor's under-king in Wales and his territorial conquests along the Anglo-Welsh border. For example, Domesday Book reveals the Welsh acquisitions of the Hundred of Exton and the high-dated parts of Attiscross, both areas in modern-day Flintshire, along with the destruction caused by Gruffudd along the frontier. From this position of strength, Harold, with an unlikely ally in Magnus, son of Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, was able to restore Aelfgar to power following his expulsion from Mercia in 1058. It is tempting to see these events as an early bout of shadow boxing between Gruffudd ap Llywelyn and the increasingly prominent Harold Godwinson. To assume so would be a mistake. But when conflict finally came during the early 1060s, the gloves for both were certainly off. Down to his death in 1062, 1062, Alfgar exploited his friendship with Gruffudd ap Llywelyn to ensure his hold on Mercia. With Alfgar's death, the earldom passed to his young and inexperienced son Edwin, leaving the Godwinsons in a position to exercise some influence over his actions and rendering Gruffudd exposed to English aggression. The death of Alfgar set the scene for the campaign whereby Harold Godwinson would seek to liquidate Gruffudd once and for all. Advancing from Gloucester at the end of 1063, Harold, at the head of a highly mobile force of cavalry, bore down upon Gruffudd as he celebrated Christmas at his court in Rhuddlan. Though Gruffudd managed to escape by sea, his court and most of his fleet were destroyed. From this point onwards, there was no turning back. Attacks on Gruffudd's realm resumed in the spring, with Harold and his brother Tostig leading a major campaign by land and sea. English troops converged on North Wales, while Gruffudd retreated into his mountainous citadel in Snowdonia. The combined pressure of attacks on land and sea no doubt intensified the internal fissures of Gruffudd's hegemony. For a long time, Gruffudd's own position had been relatively secure. Thanks to his military successes, he enjoyed the protection and support of his own men and benefited from the fear that it generated amongst his enemies in Wales. For a kingship ultimately based on military success, the 1063-64 campaigns of Harold Godwinson were a mortal blow to Gruffudd's prestige. With support ebbing away and the royal coffers significantly diminished, Gruffudd's fate was sealed. No single source lays out for us in one clear sequence the events leading up to the murder of Gruffudd. All we can say with any certainty is that Gruffudd was killed through the treachery of his own men. His severed head was presented to the English, and in recognition of his victory, Harold ordered for it to be delivered to Edward the Confessor, along with the figurehead of Gruffudd's ship. In the aftermath of Gruffudd's downfall, his uterine brothers, Bleddyn and Llywallon, the sons of Cynfyn, were given Gwynedd with prowess by King Edward in return for promises of service and tribute, while in the south, scions of the older dynasties quickly reappeared to challenge for power. With the death of Gruffudd ap Llywelyn in 1064, Wales was, as we know with hindsight, on the brink of dramatic transformation. Well, Gruffudd ap Llywelyn's reign was extraordinary. Not only did he rule Wales from north to south, but his influence and power radiated westwards into England. But it is doubtful whether even he would have been sufficiently strong to sustain his power in the face of Norman aggression. While we may question the military and personal nature of Gruffudd's rule, I think it's safe to say that he left very little resembling a lasting institutional base for his successors. Yes, there is some evidence to suggest that Gruffudd could depend on an organised system of estates and food renders for his itinerant court, but very little to suggest his imprint on other areas of administrative activity. Given the brevity and frenzy of Gruffudd's reign, I think it highly unlikely, for instance, the suggestion that he instituted the administrative division of Wales into Cantrefi and Camotes. In short, there is little to no indication that his hold on Wales was accompanied by state-building or state-integrating activities. It was much more a case of conquest and annexation, followed later by territorial and political demergers when conditions changed. Even by medieval Welsh standards, the political situation following Gruffudd's death were particularly fluid as various dynasties vied for control. North Wales in particular was in turmoil for much of the late 11th century. By way of illustration, let me attempt to reconstruct in outline the rulers of Gwynedd from 1063 to 1137, bearing in mind, of course, that at different points in this period it was divided between two or more rulers. From 1064 until 1075 it was held by Bleddyn ap Cynfyn. From 1075 until 1081 by Trehearn ap Caradog, and in the east by Robert of Rhuddlan, and then from 1081 until 1098 by the Normans themselves, and then from 1098 by Cadogan ap Bleddyn and Gruffudd ap Cynan, and then from around 1099 until 1137 by Gruffudd ap Cynan himself. And all of these individuals more or less belong to different sort of dynasties as well. Wales did not have to wait long before it felt the after effects of the Battle of Hastings. Yet, it must be stressed that William the Conqueror's initial policy towards Wales was directed more towards maintaining the security of his newly acquired throne rather than any further conquests westwards. In an attempt to secure a restless and porous frontier zone, 3 new earldoms were created: Hereford, Chester and Shrewsbury. These were entrusted to proven companions of the king, who with their relatives and followers quickly made their presence felt on the Anglo-Welsh frontier. Given that the 15 years that followed the Norman conquest of England was particularly fraught and violent in Wales, it would be wrong, however, to assume that Normans were initially seen as a serious political threat. Indeed, up until the early 1080s, the Normans appear, in the words of Rhys Davies, as little more than an additional complication. No different to the Irish, Viking and Anglo-Saxons during the earlier parts of the 11th century. Indeed, they make their first appearance in the Welsh sources as allies of various native claimants in their quest to further their own political ambitions. In South Wales, Caradog ap Gruffudd, supported by a contingent of Normans, defeated and killed Maredydd ap Owain on the banks of the river Rhymney in 1072. Bleddyn ap Cynfyn's murder at the hands of the men of Ystradtywi in 1075 led to further turmoil and opened the door to a further round of dynastic bloodletting and Norman intervention. It is true that in our chief sources, the Normans initially appear as allies in the political games played amongst the various Welsh warring parties, yet through the novelty of building castles and the imposition of direct territorial control, they soon showed that they could dictate the rules of that game. 2 events of note occurred in 1081. The Battle of Mynydd Carn in northern Pembrokeshire and William the Conqueror's expedition into South Wales. The Battle of Mynydd Carn has many of the defining qualities of the Battle of Hastings. The liquidation of political adversaries and the resounding defeat of the opposing force. In short, a clear victory by knockout. The twin victors of Mynydd Carn, Gruffudd ap Cynan and Rhys ap Tewdwr, emerged from the battle with some measure of authority as the strongest native leaders in Wales. Yet, even while the triumph at Mynydd Carn was being celebrated, the appearance of William the Conqueror and his expeditionary force in the vicinity of St David's was no doubt an ominous sign. Whatever the original intentions of William's expedition into South Wales, whether to offer prayers or, as is more likely, to make clear his authority, Domesday Book is in no doubt that by 1086, Rhys ap Tewdwr owed the king £40 per annum for his lands. If tribute and fealty were extracted from the Welsh, then in reaching St David's, William was clearly impressing on the native princelings that he had the potential to bring them to heel. When a new period of Norman advances came during the early years of William Rufus's reign, much of Wales was fair game for their ambitions. Such was the Norman onslaught that some contemporaries characterised the death of Rhys ap Tewdwr, King of the Deheubarth of South West Wales, in battle against the Normans of Brecon in 1093 as a decisive turning point, if not the end of Welsh political independence. By the early 1090s, it seemed as if much of Wales had undergone a wholesale Norman takeover. According to the Domesday Book, in 1086, the Norman Robert of Rhuddlan owed the king an annual rent of £40 for North Wales. The death of Rhys ap Tewdwr in 1093 was also to open up the relatively rich lands of the southwest to the Normans, an area hitherto spared conquest and settlement. Though it proved premature to speak of the fall of the kingdom over the Britons, it was clear that the Normans had introduced a dangerous new dynamic to Welsh politics. It is Rhugfarth ap Cilien, in his finely crafted Latin lament, who perhaps best captures the shock and awe effect of the Adventus Normanorum. And I quote, "One vile Norman intimidates 100 natives with his command and terrifies them with his look." Yet the Norman conquest of Wales proved illusory. For under the able leadership of men such as Gruffudd ap Cynan and the descendants of Bleddyn ap Cynfyn, the early Norman advances in northern and central Wales were gradually reversed in the opening decades of the 12th century. Though in places the Welsh had stemmed the tide of Norman advances, many of their inroads were not reversed, especially in the fertile southern lowlands. The expression of such fatalistic fears contrasts sharply with the remarkable surge of Welsh attempts to reverse the Norman advances during the late 1090s. The end of the 11th century saw Wales still in a process of transition and redefinition. Piecemeal Norman advances would continue into the 12th century, with victory and domination underpinned by colonisation and economic exploitation on an unprecedented scale. Norman native successes during this period were, however, partial. During the early decades of the 12th century, a new political configuration would emerge in Wales to reflect this, based on a division between Anglo-Norman controlled and native Wales. The long-lasting and ambiguous duality between native Wales, or Pŵr Awalia, and the March of Wales, March Awalia, was the legacy of this unfinished conquest. The advent of the Normans arguably marks more of a break in the history of Wales than any other event between the collapse of the Roman imperial system and the profound changes set in train at the end of the 18th century by large-scale industrialisation. True, there is more evidence, though not always satisfactory, than for the preceding centuries to paint a fuller and more variegated picture of how Wales was transformed by the Normans. Yet in almost every sense, political, social, cultural, religious, economic, and indeed linguistic, the Normans left a much more noticeable imprint than earlier Irish, Scandinavian, or Anglo-Saxon intrusions. The effects on Wales should not obscure a general phenomenon, however. The Normanisation of Wales was but one local expression of a much broader expansion of Latin Christendom into and beyond the peripheral parts of Europe during the High Middle Ages. Euryn Williams' claim that, and I quote, "the Normans made the Welsh a European people," is thus not without justification. But it should also be emphasised that the Welsh were not without enterprise. And as the 12th century wore on, native rulers demonstrated their own appetite for aggressive expansion and a willingness to embrace new cultural influences and practices. As we will see in our conference today, the survival and adaptability of native Welsh power culminated in the 13th century with attempts and the eventual failure of the princes of Gwynedd to create an enduring native principality of Wales. Well, as we have seen, during the course of the 11th century, Wales underwent a series of major changes, in some ways similar to those in England, in other ways quite different, but on both sides of Offa's Dyke, complicated by external threats and conquest. Most centuries can be said to have been, in one way or another, a watershed for Wales. But the case for the 11th century is, I think, particularly strong. By way of conclusion, and to focus our thoughts on the bigger picture of our conference on the Mortimers and the Welsh princes, I should like to sum up by reiterating the three themes which stand out to me at least during this age of conquest. In the first place, the traditional dynastic configuration in Wales was altered, albeit temporarily, by events during the first half of the 11th century. Secondly, the extraordinary career of Gruffudd ap Llywelyn had a profound, even if short-term, impact on the political map of Wales and on Anglo-Welsh relations. And finally, the arrival of the Normans and the fallouts following the demise of Gruffudd ap Llywelyn's hegemony initiated a long period of political turmoil and competition. Well, if the impact of 1066 on Wales was at times a matter of military conquest, it was also characterised by cultural and economic changes. But the political history of Wales did not come to a full stop in the mid-1090s is perhaps the most remarkable and often overlooked fact. Far from it, a much longer struggle between native and Norman now stretched ahead in Wales and across the Middle March. But of course that story belongs to our other speakers today. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much.